All right, well, welcome to the For Evansville podcast. We're really excited to continue talking to people who are for Evansville, who are contributing to the flourishing of our city in different ways. My name is Jonathan Betcher. I'm here with Adrian and Andrea Lanz. And we're excited. Andrea, welcome. Thanks for being here. And we're excited to kind of hear your story and the sort of the unique way that you are for Evansville. And you're kind of on the opposite end of the microphone today because you also have a podcast where you interview people, but today you're kind of switching roles and taking on the role of the interviewee. So
yeah, it's different. Well, thank you for having me here. You know, everything that I have learned about for Evansville, I'm like, yes, that's awesome. Partly not just because that's what my nonprofit organization, What Matters Most Evansville, kind of really aligns with, but it's also the ironic part of my story, which I'll get to, is I was not for Evansville growing up. And so it's been a really big switch and just, the whole full circle with various grief and losses that I've encountered throughout my life has brought me back to now I'm like advocating for Evansville, which is, if you would have told me when I was in high school that I would be for Evansville and that I would have a business, I would have a nonprofit to support Evansville, I would have laughed in your face. Not because I was a cruel-hearted person, but I wanted to move far, far away. I just did not think this place had potential and would allow people to flourish and to use their talents and passions. I kept focusing on the negative side of things. And since moving back, now it's my home mailing address.
Yeah.
And I never would have thought that. Now I'm like, oh, I keep seeing the positive things. And what I find so often, and I'm sure you guys experience this with For Evansville, is that when you start making connections, when you start trying to put the good out there, you see the good out there. You make those connections. You meet more people that really share a similar vision, that you're not alone, that you're not the only one that has these thoughts and unique ideas, except it's also creating a platform for people to continue sharing what their unique ideas are. What can they bring to here? How can they be their best person? And so that's kind of just my cheerleading to what you guys are doing. And I'd love to explore the ways that we can work together.
Well, that has been a very common theme. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised at how many people have come in here and said, it wasn't until I started contributing to the city that I really, really started caring for it and loved it. And so why don't you start with just walking us through that journey of different things, maybe specific examples of how you went from maybe hating Evansville and wanting to get out of here and not seeing potential to now being for Evansville.
Okay, man, it is different being on this end of the mic. All right, I encourage vulnerability, right? So I am, I was born here, raised in the area. I'm the youngest of four girls. I had loving parents. Very involved father, with almost any activity. And I had lots of ideas, but I always felt like I was too much, or this is weird, or, I don't know. Then went off to college, and, through that there were other grief and trauma that had happened. But went off to college, then again was never going to come back here. During my undergraduate studies for social work, I had, one of my jobs, in addition to Cold Stone Creamery, scooping ice cream, I was also a caregiver for seniors. My undergraduate internship was with Bloomington Home Health Hospice, and then their palliative care program at that time. And I fell in love with it. And so I was always drawn to seniors, but that was an early exposure to, hands-on death and dying experience. Fell in love with hospice. So I've worked primarily in the end-of-life care industry, since 18. So I guess half my life, 36 this year, in some capacity. And so grief and death and dying has always been something that I've accepted as a normal part of life, right? Life is special because you die. I mean, you don't have it forever. And maybe that's also part of growing up Catholic, seeing the crosses in my face all the time, a reminder that what you do matters, you will die, what will happen. So that was part of my, foundation. And then after graduation, I was, never going to come back here to Evansville. Oh, no. My plan, I didn't want to get married or have kids or get, there's that slogan, like, got sucked down the toilet hole of Evansville. I mean, there was that real terminology.
Yeah.
And I'm ashamed and embarrassed now that I even had those thoughts. It's not that I look down on people that never left Evansville. I just didn't understand why someone wouldn't want to leave Evansville or at least explore other things. And so my plan was to get, establish residency out in Colorado, get my master's, do international social work, grassroots programs, dealing with the arts. And with like multi-generational projects across the world, right? So I didn't have to be rooted in Evansville. I'd come home for maybe major holidays and events. That was my plan. And I was driving westbound of St. Louis. And ironically, I remember that night I had dinner with my parents at home. I felt like they didn't even believe my vision and my plans. And at midnight, I stuck my stuff in my car. And I started driving. I was like, you know what? I'll tell them in the morning that I made a stop, that this is real, this is happening. But I got a phone call from my aunt, who I was very close with. And she didn't. So we kind of just telepathically knew what was going on in our lives. I would talk to her every week while I was away at college. I helped clean her apartment whenever I was in high school. And I just knew. And she had some health issues. And I just knew something. She didn't say, don't go. I never actually told her where I was going. But it was one of those conversations that I still remember what the lights looked like when I was driving on the interstate.
Yeah.
And I turned around, and then I helped care for her until she died the following May.
Wow.
And then I was like, okay, my job's done. I'm done with Evansville. I'm done. And mind you, a couple years prior, I was supposed to do a big project in Tanzania with Jane freaking Goodall, like my childhood idol,
Whoa.
right?
No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, my goodness.
Because I had studied abroad and had worked with one of her colleagues at a London Youth Arts Network. But then I had to come home. My grandma was dying. My sister was married. I'd be a terrible human being if I didn't come home for that, right? So I didn't realize how much tangled up silent grief I had been carrying around all these years. And I thought I was, kind of an expert in it. That's what I did as a career. Right. I helped all these other people recognize their grief and, losses, because people begin grieving at the time of a diagnosis,
right.
All different types of losses. And so this is a really long-winded answer. But so then my sister probably gave me the best financial advice I've ever received, which was, live in mom and dad's basement for one more year, get your master's at USI. You're going to be a social worker. What are you doing? You're going to be broke the rest of your life. So I did. I signed up. I mean, I was able to, write checks as I, worked and went to school. But even starting the program, I was like, all right, nope, I'm done. Nope, I can't do this. This doesn't feel right. I started already looking at applying at different schools. But met an awesome, great friend who's from here, who shared a lot of different, similar views, I should say, about just a different approach to Evansville. And of like, gosh, if only this, if only everyone could be forever, for Evansville, which ironically happened, was created years later, right?
Yeah.
And so, long behold, I met my husband, who's not even from here. And a year later, this is the first semester in grad school at USI for my master's in social work. And a year later, we were engaged. I was like, oh, dang it. I mean, it's still a running joke. It's kind of true. And he's accepted. I'm like, you destroyed my dreams. You've ruined my life and destroyed my dreams. But it's really one of the best things that happened. We were going to go to Nashville. We were going to, out to, North Carolina, Asheville, and we just kept staying here. And other family members were, dealing with issues and other friends that had passed away. And things just kept, and at this time I'm still, working in hospice. I'd been in palliative care at this time. And then I was giving a presentation out at USI back in 2018. And I met a gentleman named Jim, who's not even from here, was new to the area, introduced himself to me, said he was a death doula. And I was like, I love you, because I want to somehow bring death doulas to Evansville. Like, what can we do? How can we make this more a death-friendly community? So
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah.
I think I've actually met Jim, and
Probably.
I remember
He's hard
him
to forget.
explaining.
He's an interesting
I remember
fellow.
him explaining what that was, and I was like, "Huh,
So if
wow!"
you-
Like that's
So if you
that's
think
really
about
cool.
a birth doula, more people are familiar with that,
Right.
helping bring life into the world, with all those transitions. They don't do the medical things, but they just help with the planning, a birthing plan, and help get resources and things in place. Similar to a death doula. They're helping someone with those end-of-life transitions and planning to birth into whatever the next life is, whatever that person believes. And so we just kept talking and ideas for a couple of years, and then it was late winter. I guess it was more kind of February of 2020. We're like, let's do this darn thing, because everything we kept talking about centered around how do we help Evansville be a more death-friendly community? And really, if it's a death-friendly community, that means that you can live friendly. If you can live well and die well, that's where it's at. How can this be a place where people know that they can live well and die well? And our conversations kept leading to, you've got to be able to grieve well. And, from all the experience that he and I had both had working in end-of-life care, we kept finding, commonalities that when grief wasn't able to be discussed, when people weren't able to talk about the hard things, when people couldn't say, I'm devastated just seeing the coffee cup in the cupboard, that resurfaces grief. If we can at least help people to acknowledge that, process that, rather than going back to some of, I'm not dogging our great German heritage that's here in Evansville, but there's some things that I'm hopeful don't remain part of Evansville. Shove it in, don't show your emotions, don't process it. I mean, that emotional trauma and grief carries on through generations. And so that was part of kind of where our work started going. And I'm not sure if I'm answering this question how you were hoping.
No, this is
great.
perfect.
Yeah.
Because I'm surprising myself.
Because we want to hear your story.
I'm
This is
surprising
good.
myself with everything that's kind of, because again, it wasn't until I met Jim did I realize just how much silent, tangled up grief that I had been carrying around for years.
Yeah.
And so as we kept talking about what to do, we were going to have like a big public invitation of like, hey, this is a really broad vision. We want people to live well and die well because we want you to be able to grieve well, all the losses. Let's have a big get together, April 2020. Well, that didn't happen. And in March, we're in the process of sitting down with WNIN to do their first community podcast to, just of interest about this conversation.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't happen. Things got deferred, and we kept sitting on things, and we thought, we can't do this any longer. Neither of us are tech savvy. I have Facebook. That's about it. I have a love-hate relationship with social media. But we started a Facebook group. We started posting weekly questions just to engage people. And that's kind of how it started. We had always talked about, maybe we'll have a radio show one day, a podcast.
Yeah.
And we had already started doing recordings for WNIN. And we're like, we're sitting on these. What are we doing? And it was our property. We didn't do it with them. And so we Googled how to do a free podcast. And here we are, 9 months in, and we've had our Rivers Fog podcast. And the reason why we chose Rivers Fog, which is possessive, river apostrophe S, like the fog of the river, like the Rivers Fog.
Yeah.
Which, coincidentally, we're sitting here at your guys' recording studio
looking at the
overlooking
river right now. Yeah.
And this morning was a really foggy morning. And we had talked about, even this morning driving in, all the patches of fog. The fog was everywhere. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's not there. When you're driving, you can't see 75 feet past you. But once you get to that 75-foot spot, you can see. But then it's additionally, the fog is elsewhere. And that's grief. I mean, grief is everywhere in our community. And if we can at least recognize grief or at least acknowledge it, maybe you don't have to have the right words. There's not a right word. Sometimes saying, this sucks, this isn't fair, I feel you, brother. We can do this. And just ways that we can unite as a community. And through lots of Jim and I's conversations, it always ended up coming back to when people can lean into the grief, when they can feel it, when they lean into their passions, their talents, what fuels them, what allows them to feel like they can flourish, they heal more wholly through their grief. So if we have a community where more people's passions and talents were supported, think if we had people everyone was doing what they were like, maybe they believe they were God-given talents or, called to do. If we had a community that really supported people being able to do that, we'd have a healthier, happier, more flourishing, healthy grieving community, because grief is good. It's a good thing. People think it's bad. But if people could recognize when we can be ourselves and, sit with the pain, that there is beauty in grief and there's joy in that journey. There's actually a counseling agency here called Joy for the Journey. I'll give them a quick plug.
Yeah.
Because they also specialize in grief too. And so that's a big rounded way of answering my journey and how I'm here. So again, now I'm creating and working on this organization to make Evansville a good place to live and die. So I guess if I got to live the full circle, I guess I got to die well here too. So that was a really long answer, but I hope
that's great.
Was
covered
helpful.
a lot of our questions.
No, that's really great. What I love about that is that, like you said, grief and death are something that we often avoid thinking about and talking about, and then it kind of invades our lives in this sort of abrupt way, seemingly abrupt, because we haven't thought about it or talked about it, and then we don't know what to do with it, and we don't know what to say, and so it's so interesting that that's something, a space that you've been kind of drawn to ever since you were young, to just kind of be present in that space. And whenever we think about the city as a whole, and like, how would our city be different if people were able to handle grief really well and approach death in all its inevitability graciously and intentionally. How do you think that would change our community? So, like, if this vision that you have for Evansville of people being able to grieve well, handle loss well, how would our community be different, or how will it be different whenever people learn to approach those things?
I'm sitting here smiling when I just think about envisioning a community that supports and embraces grief and loss, because when we are mindful that, okay, my time here is limited, what do I want to do with that time? We're more intentional about our time and energy and our resources, where we invest things, and not just where you donate your money, but even just how you invest those brief interactions when you're checking out at the grocery store. Just those small little ripples that people can make through not just being kind. That's a big part of it through the grief journey, but also allowing someone to scream and to get mad and to throw things, but creating those safe spaces. So when I think about a community, it's where everyone's able to acknowledge that, whether it be on an HR approach with every business, that they're able to acknowledge at the time of hire that we respect, time of bereavement and grief and loss. Here are options when you are dealing with struggles, and not that we limit it just to the death of X, Y, and Z people in your life, or just the grief or these specific types of grief, that we recognize that for someone that the death of their dog may be harder for them to process and to continue working that week than maybe the death of their father or their mother, just given the circumstances, the relationship, what was happening. But kind of, these larger visions and maybe some connections that I've been in the process of making is when we have, professors, integrating it into the curriculum, when we have healthcare professionals that are able to acknowledge things. We're in a very unique community where, we have a growing arts, we have a growing health, a growing wellness, growing, collegiate systems that are happening here. But if we can work together, where we have, maybe medical students that are able to recognize and have conversations with their patients in training of, yes, your blood pressure is raised. I know you've been under a lot of stress. Just acknowledging the grief rather than, you seem really down. Here's an antidepressant. This is grief. This is normal. I want you to, since you have high blood pressure, I want you to be aware that these are things to be aware of. If we can maybe do some mindfulness, if we can do some relaxation exercises, do you need to speak to a grief counselor? What are other, kind of holistic approaches to just being human rather than ignoring the grief, ignoring the stress, dealing with things in maybe an unhealthy manner. And so that was, I don't know if I answered that the way that I wish I would have, but just from all different approaches, I think that people can, I guess the best way, if you give me a topic or a business or profession, then I'd be able to answer like, this would be a really good approach.
Sure.
And not that it's about my approach. I think more than anything is really bringing in the individual unique perspective of what would help you. Hey, man, what would help you right here? Because with what matters most, it's not about Jim and I's our ideas. It's what helps you. What helps you be able to, move on the next day? What was helpful to you? What did someone say to you? Or sometimes better yet, what is not helpful?
Can you explain a little bit more about what matters most? Like, what do you do on a daily basis? What kind of services do you offer? That kind of thing.
Well, what matters most, I wish I could say on a daily basis because I'm also running my own other business. So some of the things that we do, we're really trying to work with connecting people and getting ideas that other people want to kind of see in Evansville. So maybe we should really just point them and direct them in your guys' direction. So some of the things and projects that we do, last year, we were just inspired by two folks in the community, during the pandemic, dealing with the rising decline of folks in the nursing home facilities because they couldn't touch their loved ones. And so they created a hug curtain, those clear kind of curtains to hug. And we thought, what a great idea. They're already making the ripple in the water. How can we help grow their ripple in the water? So, raise some funds. And we created that for facilities that wanted one with no fee, free of charge. We made it for them. And so it's really, how do we help spread ripples in the water that are already being made, that are helping acknowledge grief, that are helping support grief? One of the projects that we have now, which will hopefully continue beyond my death, is called Share Your Grief Story Project Anonymously, because we know that grief heals more wholly when it is shared in some context, even anonymously, so they can write things in. And then we share that on our podcast, which is one of the other outlets that we have, and, creating awareness of grief. And so we interview, we've had some nationally recognized authors and speakers, guests that may be your neighbors, to sharing their stories and their experience, striving to be that crossroad of grief and inspiration where people aren't so scared of grief that I can sit through this. There is some support. So those are some of the things that we're doing. Right now we're in connection with some of the local universities and, IU Medical School Center. And, I'm a big Brene Brown fan. If anybody out there is aware, she's a shame researcher. And so building upon her grounded theory research on shame and vulnerability, if there's a way that we can here in this community, I feel like we are perfectly positioned to be able to do research on the relationship between shame and grief and the development of chronic illnesses. Evansville per capita, we have some of the highest rates of cancer, chronic illnesses, autoimmune diseases. And what is that connection? And I've learned over the last decade of working in, the medical field, there's such a strong correlation, I can't say causation, of unresolved grief and chronic illnesses and, unaddressed trauma, which entails that grief. And so there's a lot of things that if we can approach that in many different ways, there's a lot of different hands that touch these patients. There's a lot of different hands that touch artists coming into a boutique. A lot of different ways that we can just acknowledge or connect folks. But speaking of the artists, how can we support people to do what helps them heal? What are their outlets?
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's really great. So how would you say, and you've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but how would you say this whole process of kind of finding this sort of niche where you can contribute to Evansville and can bring something that's been a big part of your life and your experience, that you're now bringing that to Evansville, hoping to help people live well and die well as a result of what you're bringing to the city? How has that played a role in sort of changing the way that you see Evansville and the way that you
It's
approach the city.
it's changed a lot because when Jim and I started this, I didn't realize that I needed it myself. You know, it's one of those things like sometimes we end up making what we need. Since doing it, and again, like even during the beginning phase of kind of our brainstorming this first couple of years, I still wasn't like for Evansville. I was just like, if I'm going to live here, I got to somehow find a way to make it better.
Right.
I got to somehow make that ripple in the water, which is kind of our theme. You know, just everyone can be a drop in the water. But since I've engaged more and connected with people who are wanting this to be a better place to live well and die well, you know, not just in the end of life circle of folks that I know, but with professors, with artists, with entrepreneurs, with people from literally all corners of Evansville, it's really helped give me hope. You know, not just for my children, but for future generations. Because again, going back to we all die. Okay, so what is the impact that we're going to make here? I kind of joke about it one day. I just want like a stamp for our What Matters Most. I want a logo stamp, you know, because what's the impact we're making that's going to be a lasting effect? Everything we do has a ripple, and why not make that a good ripple? If someone can cry, but also be able to laugh at the same time in their pains and joys, that's going to be a really good freaking ripple in the water. So again, long-winded answer. I'm not used to being the one talking so much, so now that I have the mic, is really seeing the hope and the progress. You know, every time I drive through the town, I catch myself like envisioning things, and not that it's my ideas, but just connecting different ideas that other people have had, and, you know, connecting them together for different projects, whether it be, you know, more healthy eating, whether it be for yoga, whether it be, you know, whatever it be, tool and die companies, things that they see their touch in the water that's going to help somebody else.
So you mentioned this a little bit for businesses, but if we're looking at this as a holistic view of all these areas of our life, there's work, there's our family life, then there's our free time or social time. How do you see this coming out in all areas? If somebody's listening and they say, yeah, I want to make this impact in my work, but how they also make that impact in their family and their free time, that kind of thing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. And so I haven't mentioned our lemonade stand gatherings is something that we're striving to do on a regular basis. We've only had one official one that's public, but it's literally a lemonade stand where people can come and they don't have to share their stories about grief, but if they have been impacted by grief and want to share their inspiration or their ideas of how to help support grief in our community. And it's not, you know, outside of my What Matters Most, yes, I am a therapist, but I take off that therapist hat. Are there therapeutic interventions? I mean, the heart and passion of both my businesses very much overlap, but I don't talk about me being a therapist with What Matters Most. And so we have lemonade stand gatherings. We've had them in the Master Gardener Display Garden right next to the new Grief Garden. There's a local artist at 22 Jefferson Art Studio in her side yard. She's basically said we can have our gatherings there near Haney's Corner, maybe on the first Fridays, just for people to be able to walk up, have conversations. We paint rocks that'll be left in the Grief Garden, which is, you know, open to the public, and play conversational card games. And so sometimes it can be as simple as just going to a lemonade stand. And it's those places that when you go to a lemonade stand, you think you're just getting lemonade, right? But then you have a conversation that you remember, you learn something new, or you connect, or you've got something in common. So that's kind of part of it is, you know, stirring around that lemonade. What stories can we share and stir around and see that connection?
Yeah, that's really cool. One of the things that's really interesting to hear you talk is, like you said, death is something that we all experience as part of our lives. We all lose people who are close to us, who we care about. We experience that loss, and we all know that someday we're going to encounter death, that we're going to die, and that the fact that that's true of all of us, and that we all experience that grief, that whenever we open up about it to each other and we don't try to process that grief by ourselves, that it's a really good opportunity for building those connections with other people in the community around us, really strong connections and connections that will outlast the grief as well. Andrea, thanks so much for being here with us today and for the great work that you're doing in our community. I imagine, certainly for me, hopefully for our listeners as well, that you've kind of opened up this other category of thinking that we don't often think about whenever we think, how are we going to make our city really great? We should help people think about death really well.
I know. Because if you think about death, you think about how you want to live. And
right. Yeah. And just being able to approach that well and to go into it prepared and intentional is a big deal. So thank you for kind of bringing that to mind for us and for our listeners and for people in our community. And we're excited to see where that goes and the impact that it has in our community.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure being on here. And I'll have to have you guys on my podcast.
That'd be great.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. All right, that was our episode with Andrea Lanz. Again, we're so excited that she was on here. It was really cool just to hear a different, unique perspective on just mental wellness. I know that's one of our 5 focus areas, but we haven't really had anyone talking about death.
Right. Yeah, and whenever I think of mental wellness, I tend to think of sort of cultivating a mental health so that I can be mostly happy, if that makes sense. Yeah. And had this conversation made me realize, like, mental wellness isn't really about feeling good all the time, but also being able to grieve in a healthy way and grieve in a good way. And that mental wellness is sometimes about feeling bad, but feeling bad in a good way.
And she mentioned there's that joy in the grief and in the pain and it providing empathy for others. There's a lot of good things that come out of grieving well. Yeah. And I loved her saying of when you think about your own death, it really changes the way how you think about how you want to live. Thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely has my wheels turning in some different ways because I don't often think about my own death or the death of people who are close to me. And, there's probably a balance there. You probably shouldn't spend all day thinking about death or the
But
death
if we
of other
prepared
people.
For our deaths or even those closest to us, maybe the grieving process wouldn't be as hard on the other end of that. So
because it's not as abrupt and even, sometimes with certain illnesses or certain circumstances, you are given time to prepare, if that makes sense. Like sometimes death comes suddenly and unexpectedly, and that can be really hard to cope with. Sometimes it is not so unexpected, and that can be really hard too, but it can also give us the opportunity to prepare well for it and to die well. And I think that's something that not many people really know how to do. So it's cool that Andrea and others in our community are helping people process through what that might look like. And I just love the idea that that what she's really advocating for is let's not push that part of our life out of mind and not think about it. And I think part of what also happens when we do push that away is that we tend to not know what to do with people who are grieving. Like whenever someone in my life who is close to me is grieving or is going through a hard time, it's hard to know what to say. And so you almost feel this urge to like avoid those people in a way, and like because it's uncomfortable to not know what to say, or you feel helpless or something. And even just being present with them can make such a big difference. And so whenever I think about our city and how to help our city flourish, one of the things that I'm thinking about after this conversation is like, how can I be close to those who are grieving, close to those who are suffering and going through hardship, whether it's the loss of a loved one or illness or even just some other kind of circumstance that is bringing them into a season of grief. What does it look like to be close to those people instead of to kind of withdraw from them?
And she said a huge part of that grief process is being able to speak your story and to share that. And so being present, not only just physically present for those people, but also giving them the space to share with you and maybe asking those questions, asking them to share what do they want to talk about. That's kind of what I want to take away is maybe asking good questions to those people who I know are walking through grief so that I can help them process.
Yeah, that's really good. That you don't necessarily have to have the right things to say. You can just listen well and let the other person talk and kind of express what they're going through. Yeah, that's really good. That reminds me of the episodes that we had on mental wellness a while back. One of those common themes was we all need to be better at sharing our stories and listening to one another's stories. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, I encourage you to go back and check those out. They kind of give more of a broad perspective on mental wellness in Evansville. And we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your story if you have a story that you want to share related to grief or loss, and how you're sort of processing that in Evansville. Or maybe you're like Andrea and you would say, I didn't really like Evansville, was dying to get out of Evansville. Maybe you still feel that way. We'd love to hear from you either way. And so you can send us an email, info@forevansville.org, or connect with us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, @4Evansville.